Hello, and welcome to today's webcast. My name is Julie, and I will be your event specialist today. Please note that today's webcast is being recorded. During the presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. You can ask text questions at any time by clicking on the green Q&A icon on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Simply type your question in the open area and click Send. If you would like to view the presentation in a full screen view, click the full screen button in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Press the Escape key on your keyboard to return to your original view. For optimal viewing and participation, please disable your pop-up blockers. And finally, should you need technical assistance, as a best practice, we suggest you first refresh your browser. If that does not resolve the issue, please click on the support option in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for online troubleshooting. It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Jennifer Chatlani. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. First, we have about 45 minutes of content today, and we do plan to take some questions after that. You can submit those anytime, though, during the webinar via the Q&A box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Also, near the end of the session, we will be pushing out a very short survey, so we appreciate you filling that out and giving us your feedback on what you hear today. And we will be sending you a copy of today's presentation slides and the recording, so you can expect that in your inbox within the next day or so. Obviously, a lot's changed in our world over the past, 4 months or so now, including big changes in consumer shopping and consumption behaviors. So during this session, we're going to go over what we're seeing, both from a location and purchase perspective, and we'll provide some recommendations on what advertisers can do to ensure growth going forward. And today, I am so pleased to be able to introduce you to our speakers. Drew Brunig is the Executive Vice President of Strategy at PlaceIQ, and Nishat Mehta is President of the Media Center of Excellence at IRI. Drew will be kicking us off. So Drew, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming today. So just a quick little overview of PlaceIQ, who we are and what we do. PlaceIQ has been around for about 10 years. I've been there for about 8 or 9 of those years, which feels like a lifetime. And during that time, we've been observing human behavior as told through the movements of cellular devices. So today, and we've grown a lot in size of data since then, we see about 200 million unique users per month. And as those devices move around the world, we look at the raw location, so the coordinates, the latitude and longitude, and we determine when people are visiting places. We have software that processes that and determines when someone is stopping with some intent. We compare that to our understanding of the world. We know where residential parcels are, so we can associate devices with their homes. And we know where 28 million plus commercial locations are, so we can determine if someone is visiting a store, park, beach, movie theater, and what have you. During the last 4 months, actually when kind of COVID kicked off, we decided to use our data to understand how the nation was going to react to sheltering in place and the other fun things that have come with that. Our goal was to answer the question of how far will foot traffic to various categories go, how far will it fall, and how will that foot traffic reemerge, how will it start to come back. So let's look at that at a national level to start and kind of identify the big themes and signposts of how we got here. So this chart you're looking at represents the foot traffic to various categories. We've got big box, grocery, pharmacy, mall, casual dining, fast casual, fast food, cafes, and many more categories. Each line is a 7-day moving average of the foot traffic to those venues compared to their pre-COVID norms. So if one line, like let's pick fast food, this dark purple line here, makes it all the way back above this dotted line, that 0, that has reemerged to the point that it has surpassed its pre-COVID foot traffic. So let's walk through all the beats of what we've seen in the patterns we've seen in this foot traffic so far. The first phase was the panic and prepare phase. In the beginning of March, the whole world was kind of anxious and not sure what to think about COVID yet. They were all very anxious, but they weren't sure how it was going to affect them. All of that changed on March 10th, which was the day that the NBA announced that they would be suspending their season, and that Tom and Rita Hanks announced that they were recovering in an Australian hospital from a case of COVID. All at once, the powder keg was lit by these two cultural matches, and everybody ran out to buy a lot of toilet paper, all the pasta they would need, what have you. And you can see there's a spike right here in the middle of the panic and prepare phase to big box grocery and pharmacy. Everything else just dropped to the floor. And once people had run out to get their kind of chief wares, they went back inside, and everybody stayed inside as much as they possibly could. Traffic was at the lowest we have seen relative to 7-day moving averages ever in the history of PlaceIQ. And that was the panic and prepare phase. It took about 10 days. What's notable about this is that no official shelter-in-place orders were issued until the very last of those 10 days. In the very last of those 10 days, we saw California was the first state to issue shelter-in-place orders. But what's important to note is these official orders came after everyone had already gotten inside. And that's one of the themes that we're going to see throughout this. There's kind of two different ways to look at kind of state orders. Keep in mind that state orders do not mean that people are coming out or vice versa. What we like to do at PlaceIQ is we refer to state orders as reopenings and reemergence as describing whether or not people are actually showing up. Panic and prepare lasted 10 days, and it led to the quarantine routine. This was 3 weeks when everyone stayed in their house as much as humanly possible. Traffic trends were completely flat or down with no hint of rising for almost all categories. And that lasted for about 3 weeks. We saw visitation frequency just plummet to all but essential retailers, and nothing really kind of changed. That lasted 3 weeks till about Easter. Around Easter and Mother's Day, people started to venture out to recreate some of the kind of holiday semblance at their homes. And as they did this, they realized that they could, most of these businesses had figured out how to run themselves safely under social distancing. And we've entered what we call the reemergence ramp. It's a slow ramp, but a ramp nonetheless, and one that sometimes, stalls and starts. For the first month of the reemergence ramp, traffic went up slightly only to essential retailers. So pharmacy, grocery, big box, these all went up. But malls, casual dining, entertainment, they stayed pretty low. After a month, we saw the first reopening orders at the state level start to hit. And with it, we saw kind of a second wave of growth. And you can see it midway through the reemergence ramp where we see that orange line, green line, yellow line. Those represent malls, bars, casual restaurants start to open and gain ground, almost join their kind of essential brethren. That kind of continued for a month until last week, actually 2 weeks ago, because our data lags about a week, we saw everything just pump the brakes. If you look at that last little box there, everything just flattened or shrunk. And that was because we started to see growing outbreaks in Florida, South Carolina, Arizona, and others, which caused people to start to kind of second guess going out. If we zoom in, and that's what we're looking at here, the same data just zoomed into a month, you can see a market just flatlining. Basically, everything just hit its ceiling and just stopped. So as the data flows in, we will be monitoring this more and more. If you'd like to follow along, please go to our website, PlaceIQ.com, where you can sign up for our newsletter and see this chart be updated over the weeks. But while traffic has reemerged from its lows during the quarantine routine, traffic is not just down and is not just coming back, it's actually different. And one of the reasons it's different is because our lives have not returned to normal, even though we may venture out at increasing rates. A good example of this is food. Without office workers making their daily commutes, coffee traffic to fast food has all but disappeared to only kind of the most essential workers. As such, you can look at fast food category and the traffic come back is more to lunch and or dinner. But breakfast still remains on the floor and will remain on the floor until offices reopen. So as long as some businesses remain closed, or remain just not embraced, like airports, public transit, offices, and events, you're going to see traffic come back differently. People are going to stay closer to home. They're going to opt for safer options if safer options exist, and they're going to opt for more affordable options. But they're also, all of those things are going to start to change their behavior. Here we're looking at traffic to Trader Joe's, broken out by hour of day on your normal weekday. The purple bars, or dark blue bars, are what traffic looked like during the quarantine routine, whereas the light blue bars are what traffic looked like before all of this occurred. The light blue bar showed that traffic to Trader Joe's was kind of a bell curve, but it was a bell curve that leaned towards rush hour. Peak hours were 4 and 5 p.m. as people started to head home, and then traffic would slowly fall until closure. Compare that with the dark purple, where we see massive gain in traffic share in the morning. When people don't have the constraint of having to drop children off at school or have to go to the office, they start to pick and choose their times throughout the day in a more even distribution. Now basically look like what visits to Trader Joe's look like on Sundays. It has taken the weekday routine and made it look like the weekend. You can see that exact kind of doldrum state appear in this chart as well. Instead of looking at share by hour, we are looking at share by weekday. If you look at the first chart on the left, you can see what this looked like pre-COVID. Pay attention to that dark purple line in the middle. That's casual dining. Casual dining, like going to TGI Fridays or the Cheesecake Factory, would spike on Friday and Saturday and Sunday as people kind of relaxed and unwound throughout the weeks. Similarly, grocery traffic would spike on Saturday and Sunday as people did the big shops to get ready for the week. And then the pharmacy and fast casual would not see the same rhythm. Compare that to the shelter-in-place routine. And note that I have kind of kept the X or the Y-axis the same here, so you can see how traffic is overall suppressed. But look at how there's almost no dynamic movement in this chart. Coffee is flat throughout the week. So is dealership, except when they are closed on Sunday for the most part. And pharmacy is relatively flat as well. All the dynamism of the normal weekday routine has been just dialed down tremendously. And not only has kind of time become a little bit of monotonous, we're also staying closer to home. So our days are looking more similar or the same, and the scenery we are seeing is looking the same as well. Here we're looking at a chart of how far people are willing to travel for most visits. So we look at the visits they're making, and then we compare that to their known home location and look at how far away they're traveling. And we looked at how this changed from what the February average was pre-COVID to what it was for the month, for last week of March, first week of April. As you can see, businesses like casual dining, coffee shops, and fast casual restaurants, which are more reliant on office and commute-driven traffic, shrunk precipitously the distance people were willing to drive. Casual restaurant traffic shrunk by almost 30%. People were only willing to drive just about 5 kilometers, and for those who don't use the metric system, that's about 3 miles. Overall, with the exception of dealerships, everybody is staying within 3 miles from their house. And the people feeling this pain are dining in fast casual and coffee shops. In fact, we're starting to see some reallocations of resources to adjust for this fact. Starbucks recently said that they will close or convert many of their stores to be focused around different types of services, especially those where they have either saturated the marketplace or were heavily reliant on commuter business. Meanwhile, this effect really wasn't seen for big box stores or grocery stores. The distance traveled remained the same. One interesting note is that now when we're looking at our audiences we've created audiences so that we can identify households by whether or not they are reemerging, whether they're continuing to isolate or whether they are remaining and staying in. We have seen this, that the people who have kind of reemerged more aggressively, one of the things that they do is they are much more willing to drive further distances to get a little bit of variety, whereas people who are continuing to self-isolate are staying just as close as they have for this entire duration. And one of the themes that this is affecting is there's knock-on effects. Every time we see these changes, as we see people visit grocery stores less and buy more things, as Nishat will take you through, we're seeing that that has a market impact into the way they eat at other businesses. So during the kind of overall time period we're seeing here, the themes are we're seeing greater duration of shopping. People are shopping longer at grocery stores. They're spending less time at restaurants because they're only going for pickup. They're not dining in. And we also see that the kind of morning routine is kind of decimated. So people aren't stopping to pick up coffee. They maybe do that at lunch, but they aren't doing it in the morning. Another knock-on effect is as people spend more at grocery and big box and buy bigger carts, they are less likely to dine out. Previously, before this all occurred, if someone went to Costco, it was an average of 5 days before we saw them at a restaurant. We now have seen that drop by 11 points. Actually, sorry, it was 4.5 days, and now it's moved up to 5. So it gained 11 points. Sorry, I was reading the chart backwards. For grocery, this difference is even more pronounced, which indicates that, grocery, we're seeing even more kind of volume purchases. It used to be 3 days before you would visit a restaurant, and now it's 3.5. These changes seem small, but again, this is an average. So it indicates that there are larger changes being seen by even by a large percentage of the population who maybe even waiting several more days longer. Dining out has lessened as people go out, buy fresh food, and then increase the amount of time before they dine out again. And I introduced kind of an interesting topic here that I like to kind of play with, which is the average. What is hiding in the average here? And one thing that I've been showing you so far is everything I've been showing you has been national figures. And that is a good way for you to kind of get your feet under you and understand what's happening. But when you break down these visitation trends by not the national level, not even the state, but look at it by state, we can see that the variety is quite different. So even though grocery traffic is up, in fact, or actually we're using fast food here, traffic here. Fast food traffic is up strongly compared to its February norms. It has fully reemerged if you're looking at national figures. But if you look at state figures, the picture is quite complex. Let's look at the chart, the heat map on the right. Here are all the counties in California, and they're colored based on how much their fast food has reemerged. If the county is green, it means that the fast food traffic is greater than it was before COVID. If the county is red, it means traffic is significantly less than it was before COVID, so it has not recovered. What's interesting to see here is that county reemergence varies just right next to each other. In some cases, we see some of the most red counties right next to green counties. You drive across the county line and the picture is completely different. This is kind of one of our biggest takeaways here at PlaceIQ. Recovery and reemergence are regional. There is a whole lot of detail and complexity occurring at the granular geographic levels. It is not enough to simply say things by a state or regional level. You need to get down to lower things. Part of the reason for this is that people are traveling less and they're commuting even less. So they're staying local. Outbreaks are being contained locally, which is a good thing. If you look at any of the heat maps, you see, Arizona is spiking, but it's spiking in a couple different areas. In California, our numbers are up because of a handful of counties. This is how sheltering and social distancing should work. Keep the spread to local areas. But the knock-on effect of that is that it creates local economies. And behavior can be quite different from one county to one county, creating a lot of complexity for marketers. If you look at the chart on the right, the picture is even more complex than it normally appears, because on the left is May 22nd week, and on the right, June 22nd week. And you can see some counties flip entirely, some don't flip at all, and some go in completely different directions. To highlight these, I've combined them into one map and looked at basically how much their reemergence has changed. And what it shows you is that fast food reemergence doesn't just vary spatially, but it changes over time. If a county is blue, it means traffic is going in the right direction. If the county is yellow, it means it's going in the negative direction. So even though traffic is varying greatly by county, we can also show that traffic growth is going sometimes in opposite directions by county to county. So it is an additional kind of parameter of complexity. You don't just have to worry about the counties, you also have to worry about when you are monitoring the county. But let's end on a quick good note. One of the bright spots in the nation is that we have not seen any spikes in cases in the Northeast, even as they spike in other areas. Here is fast food traffic in the Northeast, and it's largely up. What's good about this is that we have seen consistent traffic to fast food, grocery, big box, and others in areas that have not seen subsequent spikes for more than a month, which is generally how long it takes before you start to see exponential growth if exposure is occurring. This indicates to us that there are green shoots, both economically and health-wise, that will allow us to learn how to kind of conduct an economy while protecting people. We just need to identify those and kind of replicate it. So in closing for my half, there's a couple things I want you to keep in mind. The first is that reopening and reemergence are different, and they don't always align. We saw this just last week, and in that chart I shared earlier, showing you that traffic had pumped the brakes, had flatlined essentially, as people watched rising case counts. A week after the traffic flatlined, did we actually see bureaucratic responses to closing bars and other orders? People generally lead the way. They basically, the citizens are figuring out kind of what to do and what not to do in the cases where people are kind of paying attention to the greater trends. After those occurrences happen, the bureaucratic orders will follow. Similarly, they can travel in the opposite direction. In Georgia, casual dining restaurants reopened and barely anyone went except in a few counties. So the point is you can't just follow kind of the local bureaucratic orders and adjust your marketing or campaigns or business strategy against those. You need to be monitoring empirical data, looking at deterministic data to determine how reemergence is coming back in granular geographies and looking at it over time, which is the second takeaway, that reemergence is regional and it changes over time. With that, I'm going to pass it on control over to Nishat to take you through how he's seeing this data and story play out in the spend figures that IRI monitors.
Thank you, Drew, and some fascinating insights there. I think the notion of this being a local concern is certainly more clear to us now than it was 2 months ago. I think one of the things we had wanted to do with the sort of the next few slides here was to focus on a sector that hasn't necessarily changed in terms of visits. The grocery sector, the sort of CPG retail sector, in some sense we all still needed to eat regardless of what was going on in the country around us. What has changed is quite significantly the way in which we're consuming, the types of products we're consuming, the brands we're selecting, et cetera. And so we thought we could take a few minutes to walk through what that looks like. So brief background on where our data is collected. We do collect data from a wide variety of retailers, and then we collect them from different sources. So we get point of sale data, which is just sort of straightforward UPC level data at the store for virtually every retailer in the country that sells CPG products. We then also have a loyalty card database, a number of retailers that actually provide loyalty cards. You see many of them listed here on the left. We've built a database of loyalty card data, and that allows us to actually understand household consumption over time. And then we have a panel of 110,000 households for which we can actually survey them with more qualitative questions. And you'll see as we go through this that the data comes, frankly, from a wide variety of these different sources in order to sort of help us understand a more complete view of the data. So a couple of quick slides that I wanted to use, and I know some of the numbers here might be a little bit difficult to read. I'll walk through them briefly. But we house this data on our website. On a weekly basis, we update it. And it basically consists of a series of different reports that I think give us a sort of a macro view of the CPG and CPG retail space. So this is simply a week-by-week report heat map that identifies total CPG and then edible versus non-edible. And the number represents an index of this week's sales, or the current week's sales versus its equivalent week last year. And so what you'll see here is that total CPG is consistently up. Edible is up more, and non-edible is up, but not by as much. And the general thought here is that we are beginning to see that even total edible is beginning to come down, but probably settling in at what might truly be a new normal around the kind of 110 to 115 range. And frankly, that 15% kind of increase year over year can no longer really be attributed to pantry stocking, given that we're now 3 months away from the true kind of peak panic buying behavior that Drew alluded to. And so really this 10 to 15% increase represents the increased consumption in home, the fact that we are not going to work as often, therefore we're eating lunches at home more often, the fact that we're not going to restaurants as often, and again, therefore those meals are being consumed at home. And then even things like, for instance, the fact that children are not in schools, certainly up until 3 or 4 weeks ago, and therefore a lunch that might have been eaten out of the home, one additional individual is at least one is consuming that occasion at home. And so we think this is likely to be the sort of new normal for quite some time, at least until the health scare is actually gone and people feel more comfortable getting back to the levels, not just for fast food, but across all levels of dining out. Schools go back to normal. People start going back to an office, at least, maybe not as much as they used to, because let's face it, working from home is probably going to increase as a result of this, but certainly more so than they are today. If we dive a little bit more deeply into the types of retailers, there's a few different entries here on the left. MULO C represents multi-outlet plus convenience, so it truly is the kind of universe of CPG retail. MULO does not include convenience, so it refers to things like grocery, mass, drug, club, etc. And then we specifically broke out grocery and convenience because those two channels are actually where you're seeing the shift. And what you'll see, even if you can't read the numbers, is the color coding will make it pretty clear that as it relates to the total store, grocery has continued to do quite well. And in fact, it's largely because of the fact that one trip to a grocery store can pretty much get you everything you need, both edible and non-edible, versus convenience, which certainly struggled in the sort of peak quarantining times. You'll see the first 2 weeks here, which represent really the first half of April. Convenience numbers were actually negative, seriously negative as it relates to edibles, and in fact have remained negative on the edible line, even though the non-edibles and total convenience have actually come back. And so really I think the right way to read this is as people are not driving around as much, they're not visiting convenience stores as much, and therefore they're not going to be buying as much from convenience stores. As they've begun to reemerge, as they've begun to get back on the road, they're still preferring to go to a grocery store for most of their food and beverage purchase, and trips to the convenience store are typically more for non-edible products, paper products, and things along those lines. The number of trips has remained relatively consistent. I think you saw some of that from Drew's presentation. The time periods during the day and the weeks of the day obviously have shifted quite a bit, but the number of trips in any given week has remained largely consistent. But in fact, the basket size has increased significantly. You see the numbers here again, total CPG up, call it again another 10 to 15%. Edibles are up anywhere from kind of 14 to 25%. So again, people are buying more food, and again, it's logical because they're consuming more of it. And so a number of things that come to play here, right? They're visiting the grocery store the same number of times. They are likely spending less time in a grocery store just by virtue of the health scare that is going on, yet they're actually buying more while they're there. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means here in a bit. So now a series of additional trends that we begin to see. So this is actually going back to what now seems an eternity ago, the week of March 15th, which is consistent with the week that Drew alluded to as kind of the cultural touchstones of the NBA, and Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson indicating that they had tested positive. This was the sort of peak buying week that we saw. In fact, March 12th and 13th were a Thursday and a Friday. Those 2 days were almost a doubling of their equivalent day a year ago in terms of CPG purchase. So, significant increases on those 2 particular days. And what you'll see is in certain categories, especially categories that might be consistent with things like comfort foods, the dark blue line represents a percentage change versus a year ago. And so you'll see things like coffee up 61%, cookies up 50%, et cetera. So again, massive increases in certain categories, in particular the ones that you see listed here. Private label has been up quite a bit, so now we're actually looking at a slightly broader time frame. This is actually a survey that we did in mid-April. Private label going up is not surprising. I think we all are aware of the assumption that an economic downturn is either we're already in one or it is still to come and get a little bit worse before it gets better. What I think is surprising about this are 2 things. One, that upper income individuals are also shifting more to private label. You'll see that in the sort of dark gray line on the left bar in food and beverage in that week of March, or the 2-week period between March 29th and April 12th, a significant increase in terms of private label purchase. But the stat that's more interesting to me is the 54% number. And 54%, typically when people switch to private label, it's because they're choosing to save money. In this particular case, half of folks switched to private label just as much for saving money as they did because the brand that they actually wanted to purchase wasn't available. In other words, we have an economic challenge on top of a supply chain challenge, and those 2 things put together actually shift some behavior versus what we've previously seen in economic downturns. We have done quite a bit of research around the process by which you can best convert a trier of a brand into a repeater. And what we find in terms of, as it relates to media, is that advertising actually is one of the best levers you can pull in order to convert a trier to a repeater. And in fact, on average, 35% of new brand buyers, if they are reached with an advertisement in the first purchase cycle after a new purchase, 35% of them will convert, an incremental 35% will convert into repeaters. And in fact, that number cuts in half with each purchase cycle of your product. And so reaching them quickly within that first purchase cycle is actually quite important. I think what's oftentimes forgotten is it's not only important to reach out to a set of individuals that have newly tried your brand, but it is just as important, in fact, potentially even more important, to make sure that individuals or households that were loyal to your brand previously, forced to try a different brand during this last few months due to a supply chain issue or some other concern, that if you don't reach back out to them, you have the potential of losing them forever to your competition. And that, again, losing your loyals is oftentimes even more harmful than actually retaining new buyers. I think I heard a great quote that was, churn is the new growth, which I thought was an interesting statement to be made in these times. E-commerce, certainly accelerating. Again, I think we've all heard that. We all see that in terms of our own, probably your own behavior. My sense is you have probably, each of you on this phone has probably spent more personally on e-commerce in the last 3 or 4 months than you did previously. These stats indicate some of that. So this is data as of mid-May, so it is admittedly a bit dated right now. But as of mid-May, what you were seeing is actually an acceleration of e-commerce purchase. So it wasn't just that people switched to e-commerce during sort of the period of time where they felt it was, least safe to go out. But even as the economy has reopened, as reemergence is beginning to happen, the latest 4 weeks in this period, which did include a few weeks in May, you actually saw an increase in growth year over year versus the prior quarter and the prior year. And so what you really are seeing here is that e-commerce is accelerating, which is, again, a signal that people are not just choosing to try e-commerce, but in fact are recognizing the convenience of it and continuing to spend and shifting more and more of their purchase to that channel. In the grocery world or in the CPG world, e-commerce actually means multiple things. It's not just home delivery, but e-commerce does also include click and collect. Think about e-commerce as the point of sale, not the point of fulfillment. So the fact that I actually execute an order through a website, even if I have to physically go to the store to pick it up, is still considered an e-commerce order. And what you'll see as you look through the e-commerce data that we have is that we feel fairly confident that click and collect, the notion of actually buying something online but picking it up in store, is likely to grow faster than home delivery is in the space, in the CPG space. A couple of stats that indicate that: certainly people are openly stating that they will pick up in store more often. There are people that indicate more concern about the price of home delivery and the price of shipping fees versus the price of curbside service. And when we talk to the supply side of the equation, the actual retailers themselves, today at least, home delivery cannot make economic sense at any scale. They just can't get the price points low enough to meet consumer demands on what consumers are willing to pay for home delivery, whereas click and collect you absolutely can. And so we think click and collect is certainly going to be the future of e-commerce and CPG, at least into the next 12 and 18 months. Certainly over time we will see more and more shift to home delivery, but the next 12 to 18 months, click and collect, in our opinion, is really the big growth opportunity for brands and retailers. And then I think the sort of the last interesting comment that I'll make here before we sort of start to think about some summarization is that 42%, this in my opinion is a stat that's quite valuable, 42% actually spent less time shopping in a store. So again, putting a bunch of things together, almost half the population spends less time shopping. There are more items or more expensive items on their basket, on their shopping list, because basket sizes are actually up. And there's greater consumption in the home. I think when you put all of that together, what you really are focused on is, whereas in-store marketing used to be extremely important to a brand, you have more and more consumers who are entering a store, not only one, knowing what they previously wanted to buy, but wanting to minimize the amount of time they spend in the store. And therefore their browse time in stores, their willingness to change their mind in the store, is actually lower today than it was 4 months ago. I think that starts to speak to the importance of advertising, because you do now need to reach these individuals before they've actually put something onto a shopping list, because more so than ever, once it's on the shopping list, it may as well be purchased. So switching directions a little bit, moving away from the actual CPG behavior, I wanted to quote a stat from the Advertising Research Foundation, in particular the Journal of Advertising Research, going all the way back to 2009. They had done some research on a wide variety of prior recessions, the 1974 recession, the oil shock, the early 80s recession, the early 90s recession. And what they basically did was track a set of brands and their advertising spend both into and then during the actual recession, and then they tracked their sales, again, into, during, and then post the actual recession versus their other category competitors. And what they found is that on average, and the graph on the right focuses on the 90 to 91 recession, that in fact brands that maintained or increased their advertising spend into and during a recession actually enjoyed a 78% improvement versus those that did not in terms of sales and share growth going forward the next 5 years. And similar numbers are indicated on all prior economic downturns that they measured. And so again, there is this argument to be made that prior research does show that advertising in times of economic downturn actually does pay off. There's a number of reasons for that. Media prices typically are lower during economic recessions. Competitors oftentimes do go off the air, and as a result, your share of voice increases. There just are fewer advertisers in general in market, whether they're competing with you or not. And so your ability to sort of cut through the noise is typically increased. So for, again, a variety of reasons, we think advertising during economic downturns actually does pay off, and the research would seem to indicate that. So putting all of that together, I would sort of close on a slide here that really just focuses on this idea of people are changing habits like never before. And again, I don't need to say that to everyone on this phone, because my sense is everyone on this phone probably feels that about their own households. Consumers are buying larger baskets at larger stores, and typically through, or not typically, but significantly increased through e-commerce and other forms that minimize their amount of time that they have to actually spend in a physical store. Retailers are actually resulting in sort of limiting the UPCs on shelf. One example of this is with bars closing. grocery stores are now finding themselves selling far more alcohol than they used to. They're dedicating more space to the AlBev category, which means they necessarily have to take that space away from something else. When they take that space away from something else, they're typically going to be focused on larger pack sizes because all of us are consuming more of everything we buy. And so what you end up with now is that retailers are going to start limiting the number of choices that they actually make available to you, and marketers will have to react to that by defending their shelf space. We believe that marketers should ensure that their share of voice at least matches their share of category, typically exceeding in these times, as you saw earlier, going to be beneficial. And then lastly, what I mentioned earlier, that brands, it's really important for brands to be thinking not just about the in-store channel, but to actually get into people's minds and into their decision matrix before they've actually added something to a shopping cart, because whether it's an e-commerce order or an in-store order, they're spending a lot less time able to be influenced by the things that used to influence them about the in-store experience. So with that, we've got a couple of suggestions on what we can do as marketers, and Drew, I'll turn it over to you for this. You might be on mute, Drew.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Cool. So one of the things that we recommend is, when faced with growing complexity, as analysts or data scientists or business strategists, you kind of have two options. When it comes to kind of making decisions and having understanding of the ecosystem that you're working in. The first is you can create models to try to kind of detail what you're seeing and predict what's going to happen. The second is you can monitor and basically try to understand what's occurring by reporting on it deterministically as fast as you possibly can. There's some of people who are going out there trying to create models, and we hope they do succeed for everyone else there. But we believe that this is just such a once-in-a-lifetime, crazy event with so many different things that no one was able to predict, that we heavily favor that most companies should focus on just monitoring. And doing this at a granular level so that you understand the complexities at the actual, at least county level. If you're monitoring only at state, you're wasting a whole lot of efficiency by targeting places that you believe have emerged but have in fact not. So see where reemergence is occurring using granular data sets and track them weekly. As we've shown, they vary weekly in both directions. Finally, the thing that's incredibly important here is understanding and segmenting audiences. Message regions and households by how much they're reemerging. So we've built some audiences to do this, basically looking at the behavior of households, looking at what it looked like before COVID, and then looking at, does it exist anymore? Is it still sheltering, or is it fully reemergent? This is really important because what we're seeing is, even at the county level, variation is quite present by household. You can see this in Arizona and Florida just by looking at the recent infection trends. The median age of the growing populace that is contracting COVID is actually closer to 35. It's incredibly young because the higher risk people are continuing to socially isolate. So even at the county level, we're seeing quite a difference in kind of variability. So you need to account for these growing kind of complexities at these areas. Otherwise, you're going to lead to a lot of inefficiencies. So with that, pass that back to Nishad to take it away for the next.
Sure. I think continuing on that trend, the notion of segmenting audiences, we certainly recommend trying to find your new buyers, and maybe more, just as important, identifying the at-risk and lapsed buyers that have potentially tried a competitor. How do you actually make sure that you keep them in your fold? We also think that, again, as reemergence occurs and you start to get some understanding of what food service locations they're reaching, that can factor into your targeting decisions as well. Pantry affinity, again, as more and more folks cook at home, you start to have the notion of a purchase of one item actually being a pretty good signal for purchase of an adjacent or a complementary item. And so we have built a set of audiences that help understand what types of products tend to co-purchase together, and you can leverage buyers of one into finding potential buyers of the other. Certainly the flexibility piece is one that we've mentioned before. I think that's an important point to mention, just that we are all a little bit less loyal to our brands than we were a few months ago. At the end of the day, I know for certain that we used to be a non-toxic cleaning household. We clearly have changed our behavior over the last few months and moved very much back to the sort of more traditional Lysols and Cloroxes of the world. And we probably are less loyal to either of those brands in that we will take whatever we can find in the physical store. So households are more flexible, and again, it becomes important to reach them at this time. And then the last comment here is around e-commerce growth, that it's oftentimes the case that e-commerce can be seen as a little bit of a black box, and you don't want that to be seen as a household who stopped buying your product, but rather somebody who continues to buy your product, just chooses to buy it through a different channel. And then I think if we take that one step further, we've talked a little bit about the notion of defending existing brand buyers. The last point I'll mention on this slide is really around frequent optimization. Drew alluded to the notion of kind of leveraging deterministic data and understanding the behavior since the COVID period started. We also can't predict what next week will look like. In fact, Drew pointed out the fact that behavior looked like it was on an uptrend, and then in the last week, as everything sort of started to look a little dangerous in the Sun Belt states, you started to see declines as well. And so we believe very strongly that the notion of setting up some perfect 12-week campaign that you can kick off today and set it and forget it maybe didn't exist before. It certainly doesn't exist now. So this notion of constantly measuring and constantly optimizing, knowing that the world we live in changes from week to week, is really important. Drew, I'll pass it over to you.
Cool. So, look, to combine these signals together and to kind of build it into effective tactics, one of the things that we are seeing is that options that are available to customers that are safe or perceived as safe, affordable, and nearby are replacing those that are not. A really good example of this is fast food restaurants, which continue to grow. And the reason they're growing is because fast food restaurants have now become almost an entertainment option, a place you take your kids when you need a little bit of a break, even though you're not leaving the car, especially during those earlier days. So anything that you can do that is easy, nearby, and is perceived as safe starts to grow. So fast food is one example. Another example are beaches. Beaches are outdoors, easy to social distance, and very affordable. As we've covered today, consumers are shifting to a kind of a savings mindset, even if they haven't even been impacted. So they're looking for affordable options. Third, another example of this trend is that, public transit and airports are not considered safe. So we're seeing other behaviors that are replacement behaviors growing. Dealership traffic is up, and auto sales have rebounded slightly, more than we would expect. Another great example right now that is personally annoying me quite so much is that it's almost impossible to find a bicycle right now. They are sold out everywhere because people are using them to replace public transit and to replace gyms, two other things that are being closed. So we're seeing a swapping and exchange behavior when people can do this. So combining our location signals with IRI's purchase signals, you can use this data to take advantage of these trends and message to your audiences in a way that's appropriate based on how reemergent they are, behaviors they've exhibited in the past, whether or not they've swapping behaviors, and what their current purchases are. You can take all the complexity and manage it by using simple segmentation as we've offered here.
Great. So we'll close with this slide. A lot of the data that we've pulled obviously comes from some very deep data sets that both of our companies have. We've actually made a number of these data sets in some form or another available through our website. On our website, you'll find sort of a couple of different sections, one that focuses on a series of thought leadership sort of curated pieces that we create and publish every week. And then you will also find the examples of the red and green heat maps that I had shown earlier. We update that weekly on our website as well, so you can see on a weekly basis how different categories, different retail formats, different states, regions, departments basket sizes, et cetera, update each week by a variety of different categories. And then Drew PlaceIQ also has some information if you want to speak briefly to that, and then we'll open it up for some questions.
Yeah, once or twice a week we send an email with the most recent numbers, and we also find different stories and narratives each week and the business implications of that. So greatly encourage you guys to peruse past issues, which are still pretty highly relevant. Send out the links quite a lot at placeiq.com/blog, and you can also sign up for our email newsletter there. Cool.
So with that, Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll open it for questions.
Yeah, excellent. Great. Thank you, Nishat and Drew. This is really interesting and I think relevant for most of us on the line. We are now going to move into the Q&A portion. As we mentioned at the beginning, you can enter your question in the box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And in the meantime, we're also going to push out a very short survey that we'd ask for you to please complete. Julie, can you please push out that survey now? And it does look like we already have some questions that have come in. So Drew, do you mind getting us started with the first question, please?
Sure. There's a couple here. CJ Reiser, you asked, did I mention the reason to analyze data by region and county rather than state? We actually do both. In both of our reemergence data sets, we produce those at the state level and at the county level. The reason we analyze at the county when doing our own internal analysis, and why we recommend you all use county, is that there's still quite a ton of granularity amongst the counties. As you can see in big counties like California and Texas, their most reemerged county can be incredibly high, and their least reemerged county can be incredibly low, depending on the category. So just by targeting by, Nevada or Utah, you can have such a wide range of recovery in there that causes that to occur. When you get into smaller states like Vermont, New Hampshire et al., it's kind of less variety because, again, there's fewer counties, smaller populations. But when you look actually east of Texas, it's pretty hard to even spot the state lines in most of our plots because the variety is so patchworked and because people are staying close to their county because of that. So that's the reason we pick it, is because movements are staying very close to their county. There's not a lot of inter-county travel, and because of that, you're seeing highly distinct patterns at the county level that are much more granular than the state.
I think there's a good question here about the importance of advertising, and in particular, which advertising channels are more effective than others, network TV, streaming services, et cetera. It's an interesting question. I think, every advertising channel serves a specific purpose: reach, scale, long form, short form, et cetera. I think what we typically find in times like this is that addressability and optimizability are probably the two things to focus on. Addressability, because now more so than ever, you should make sure that you're pinpointing the specific individuals you want to reach, individuals that have recently tried your brand, individuals that have potentially left your brand, individuals that have indicated a willingness to actually reemerge and therefore engage with your brand differently. And then you want to be able to optimize, given that the answers to all three of those questions change on a weekly basis. And so things like digital, are probably going to be better than network TV. Connected TV might be a little bit better than network TV. Flip side, obviously, to all of this is that we don't know when we will return to a new normal. And so I'm not willing to suggest at all that network TV is not a good form of advertising. It's just in these particular moments, given how uncertain the next, several weeks, next several months are going to be, we would tend to focus more to addressability and optimizability. I think maybe one more question and then we can close. I guess there was a question here about e-commerce. Can we now conclude that e-commerce has become a consumer habit? How does a brand potentially recover a lost brand client from an online substitution? So I think there's a handful of ways to do that. So first, again, in the CPG world, we do have the benefit of having a number of retailers that do provide click and collect services. And so again, this notion of e-commerce doesn't necessarily just mean the sort of closed ecosystem of Amazon. It does actually include when somebody buys online at a Kroger and then ultimately goes and picks it up. So that is one way to do things. And then two, there are a host of panel capabilities that we do leverage, and panel services that are, recent behavior in the last week, in the last month, that do allow us to understand a set of households and potentially some modeling behaviors that we can leverage on recent behavior, not modeling the last 52 weeks, which, let's call it 40 of the 52 weeks are less relevant, but modeling based on the most recent 12 or 15 weeks, on which we can actually build models to reach others for which we may not actually have visibility directly into their baskets.
Something that we're also seeing is some e-commerce or delivery behaviors are more resilient than others. One of the things that I think is most interesting is that during the quarantine routine, when traffic was at its low, pharmacies were a top 3 destination. Pharmacies, grocery, and big box were the big 3. Now, pharmacies are actually lagging. They just have not made the recovery that grocery and big box has. They've stayed stubbornly stuck at like 65, 70% of their traffic. In talking with lots of people, one of the reasons that we found for that is that their foot traffic is so down because basically people converted their prescriptions, their recurring prescriptions, into delivery, and they're never going to go back. I mean, there's no reason to turn that off when, there's a difference between shopping for groceries online and click and collect, where, you still may want to go in and browse if you're cooking for something new, when all of this is over. But for pharmacy, there's no reason to do that. You're getting the same pills every week. It's not a discussion. So that has led to what appears to be right now kind of a permanent loss in traffic. And so pharmacy is a really interesting one because they've kind of traded that delivery for the pickup or for the in-person pickup, and as a result, they're going to have to find different ways to expand from that. So even when e-commerce shifts and it's to your business, it may create other problems that you're going to have to solve elsewhere.
So I know we're at time. I think we want to thank you guys all for joining. I think there were a couple of takeaways. We would focus very much on the notion of addressability, making sure that you actually reach the individuals that you can, recognizing that lots of behavior has changed and will continue to change. We think deterministic data, both for targeting the right audiences as well as for measuring and optimizing, are quite critical. I think probably the last and maybe most important point I would mention is we have proof from 40 years of history that show that advertising during times like this actually has probably more so of an effect, of a positive effect on your brand than it does in other times, and therefore it's kind of a strong opinion just based on history that this would be the absolute best time for you to make sure that your brand is staying top of mind amongst your consumers. Drew, anything else to add?
That's, I think, wraps it up. Get data and make data-driven decisions.
Great. Thanks, everybody.